Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a city alive with sound and brilliance. Bells ring from cathedral towers, merchants haggle in crowded markets, and the air is heavy with the smell of ink, parchment, and fresh bread. Artists stand on wooden scaffolds painting great visions on plaster walls, sculptors hammer marble into human form, and philosophers debate beneath arches where light pours in from high windows. This is Florence at the dawn of the Renaissance, a city whose beauty and genius would forever change the world. But what if I told you that behind the art, the music, and the rediscovery of ancient knowledge stood not a king or an emperor, but a family of bankers? Not warriors or conquerors, but men and women who moved coin and paper, shaping the destiny of Europe in ways so subtle that they seemed invisible. The Medici family were not rulers in the traditional sense. They did not march armies across borders or wear crowns upon their heads. Instead, they learned to master the most powerful force of their time, money. Yet their story is not about mere wealth. It is about how they used that wealth to fund masterpieces, support great thinkers, and guide political events that reshaped history. The Medici discovered something extraordinary. Money, when placed into motion through art, philosophy, and science, could build more lasting empires than swords ever could. Think of it like this: Michelangelo's David, Brunelleschi's magnificent dome, Botticelli's ethereal birth of Venus. None of these might exist without Medici patronage. These icons of human creativity were, in their own way, investments, carefully calculated acts of power disguised as generosity. Every painting, every library, every chapel echoed a message. The Medici were not only Florence's bankers, they were the custodians of its greatness. Their invisible hand guided not only the wealth of Europe, but also the imagination of a civilization. Yet their influence did not stop with beauty. Their innovations in banking created systems that still echo today in the way our economies function. Double-entry bookkeeping, letters of credit, international branches. These may sound technical, but they were revolutionary, laying the groundwork for global trade and modern capitalism. And with this financial might came the ability to influence popes, kings, and governments. Their power was hidden, but it was everywhere, in the frescoes of churches, in the debts of monarchs, and in the ambitions of explorers. So who really shaped the Renaissance? Was it the artists and thinkers we celebrate, or was it the financiers who made their work possible? The Medici family invites us to explore this question, and in doing so, they force us to reflect on our own world. Who funds our visionaries today? Who decides what ideas flourish and what voices fade into silence? The story of Florence is not just history. It is a mirror, showing us that the invisible hand of finance still shapes the world we live in, often in ways we do not see until centuries later. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video we will uncover how the Medici turned banking into power, money into art, and patronage into an engine that fueled the Renaissance, leaving behind a legacy that still influences our lives today. Imagine walking through the narrow streets of Florence in the early years of the Renaissance. At first glance, the city seems alive with artists painting frescoes, merchants bargaining in busy markets, and scholars reading ancient texts in candlelit rooms. Yet behind this visible energy was another force, quieter but more powerful, steering the fate of Florence and eventually much of Europe. It was not a king commanding armies or an emperor expanding borders. It was a family of bankers whose influence was so deep and so subtle that it can be compared to an invisible hand guiding history itself. This family was the Medici, and their story is not just about riches or patronage of art, but about how financial creativity and quiet control of power shaped the world we live in today. The Medici did not begin as rulers or even noblemen. They were not born with crowns or titles. Their rise came through money, but not in the ordinary sense of hoarding wealth. Their innovation lay in how they managed, moved, and multiplied money. Florence, during the 14th century, was already a thriving hub of commerce. It traded in wool, silk, and precious metals. But trade alone could not explain the vast cultural explosion that soon took place. The key to unlocking that transformation lay in banking, in the creation of financial systems that allowed wealth to be stored, invested, and spread across borders. This was where the Medici found their strength, and through this strength, they influenced not only Florence but also the very structure of European power. At the heart of their success was the Medici Bank, founded in the early 15th century by Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici. Giovanni understood something that few of his rivals grasped fully. Money was not simply a tool for exchange, but a tool for influence. By creating a banking network that stretched across cities such as Rome, Venice, London, and Bruges, Giovanni built channels of power that were as effective as any army. The Medici Bank introduced accounting methods and financial practices that seem familiar to us today. Double-entry bookkeeping, letters of credit, and the idea of using financial trust to bridge distances. These tools allowed merchants to trade more securely, popes to fund their projects, and monarchs to finance their wars. In every case, the Medici stood at the center, providing not only the money, but also the stability and confidence needed for larger ventures to flourish. What made their influence even more striking was how invisible it often appeared. The Medici rarely stood on the battlefield, yet they decided which rulers had the money to raise armies. They did not wear crowns, but they financed the papacy, giving them influence in spiritual matters that extended across Christendom. Their power was not proclaimed with trumpets, but it seeped into the foundations of institutions, from governments to churches, until their hand was everywhere, unseen but decisive. It is here that the comparison to an invisible hand becomes more than a metaphor. The Medici turned finance into a form of governance, where control of credit and loans became a subtle way of steering decisions far beyond Florence. Giovanni's son, Cosimo de' Medici, expanded this role even further. Cosimo was not content with being a banker who supplied credit. He understood that money could purchase more than goods. It could purchase loyalty, legitimacy, and even memory. Through careful loans and quiet gifts, Cosimo gained allies among political families of Florence. He never openly declared himself a ruler, yet Florence moved according to his will. He installed allies in key positions, ensured rivals were weakened, and, when necessary, used exile rather than open confrontation to remove opposition. This invisible leadership was more stable than any violent overthrow, and it allowed Florence to maintain the image of a republic even as one family subtly guided its destiny. But Cosimo's vision stretched beyond politics. He saw in art and learning an opportunity not only to enrich Florence, but also to bind the city's identity to the Medici name. He financed the building of churches, commissioned architects to design palaces, and supported scholars who translated ancient texts. By doing so, he created a cultural legacy that made Florence the beating heart of the Renaissance. Yet even this generosity was tied to finance. Art was not just beauty, but an investment in reputation. Buildings were not only structures, but monuments to permanence. Scholars were not only thinkers, but symbols of prestige. Through such patronage, the Medici transformed money into culture, and culture into power. What is remarkable is how this pattern continued across generations. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, embodied this intertwining of finance, politics, and art. He inherited not only wealth, but also the strategy of using that wealth invisibly. Lorenzo deepened Florence's role as a center of culture, supporting artists like Botticelli and the young Michelangelo. Yet behind the splendor of patronage was the same financial machinery that had begun with Giovanni. The Medici Bank, though facing difficulties by Lorenzo's time, had already established the family as indispensable to popes and kings. The family's influence reached the highest levels of European politics, shaping alliances and negotiations, often through loans and credits rather than armies. The Medici story reveals something profound about the nature of power. In an age often remembered for knights, battles, and royal dynasties, the Medici show how influence could be exercised quietly through trust, credit, and debt. Their financial innovations gave Europe a new way of organizing wealth and authority. By extending credit rather than demanding immediate payment, they allowed monarchs and popes to act beyond their immediate resources. By creating systems of accounting, they enabled trade to expand safely across regions. By centralizing wealth into networks, they created the first stirrings of international finance. This was not merely about Florence. It was about the groundwork for the world economy we recognize today. The question, then, is how a single family's financial creativity could shape not only their own city, but also the modern world. The answer lies in the combination of subtlety and scale. The Medici operated with discretion, often appearing as servants rather than rulers, yet their network reached across Europe. Their financial tools became so effective that they endured long after the family's direct power waned. Double-entry bookkeeping, the use of bills of exchange, and the culture of trust in financial institutions all became embedded in European commerce. These tools later allowed the rise of large-scale trade, the financing of exploration across the oceans, and the birth of capitalism itself. Behind these shifts, the Medici had already tested and refined the mechanics. One might imagine history shaped by kings on horseback or armies storming walls. Yet the Medici remind us that history can also be shaped by contracts, ledgers, and quiet agreements made in candlelit rooms. Florence's golden age was not only the result of painters and sculptors, but also of bankers who created the conditions for those artists to thrive. Without financial stability and patronage, Michelangelo might never have carved David, Brunelleschi might never have raised the dome of Florence's cathedral, and Botticelli might never have painted his famous scenes. Each of these achievements, celebrated as pinnacles of human creativity, was in part the fruit of financial support designed and directed by the Medici. The invisible hand of Florence was not a single gesture, but a series of careful decisions, carried out across generations. It was Giovanni understanding that money could be spread across borders. It was Cosimo realizing that reputation could be purchased with art and alliances. It was Lorenzo embodying the fusion of finance and culture. And it was the family as a whole creating a template for how wealth could be turned into power without crowns or armies. Their story is not only about the past, but also about the systems we live with today. The banking networks of the Renaissance became the models for modern banking. The idea that financial institutions can shape politics and culture remains true in our own time. The Medici were not only the hidden hand of Florence, but also the architects of the financial foundations of the modern world. Imagine again the bustling streets of Florence, with merchants calling out the price of cloth, artists grinding pigments, and goldsmiths hammering out delicate designs. Beneath this visible world of sound and color ran another current, a quieter system that would change how humanity thought about money and trust. It was here that banking, in a modern sense, was born, and at the heart of that transformation was the Medici family. Their genius did not lie only in lending coins or storing wealth, but in reimagining how financial systems could work, turning abstract concepts into practical tools that supported both trade and culture. To understand the importance of their contribution, one must first look at the state of money and trade before their rise. For centuries, merchants across Europe struggled with the risks of long-distance trade. If a Florentine merchant wanted to buy wool in Flanders or spices in the eastern Mediterranean, he faced not only the uncertainty of storms and bandits, but also the difficulty of carrying vast sums of coin across dangerous roads. Gold and silver were heavy, easily stolen, and difficult to transport safely. In addition, currencies varied from city to city, with different values and standards, making exchange a complicated matter. Trade was vital, yet it was bound by limitations that seemed nearly impossible to overcome. This is where the Medici introduced methods that sound ordinary to us today, but were revolutionary in their time. Double-entry bookkeeping was one of these innovations. Instead of simply writing down what was owed and what was spent in separate lists, this system balanced every transaction by recording it twice, once as a debit and once as a credit. At first, this might appear like an unnecessary complication, but it had immense consequences. By balancing each entry against another, errors became easier to spot, fraud harder to commit, and financial clarity more achievable. A merchant in Florence could look at his ledger and see not only how much he had spent, but also how that spending related to income, debts, and profits. This provided a clearer picture of the health of a business and created a new kind of financial transparency. Alongside bookkeeping came the letter of credit, a document that transformed trade routes. Imagine a merchant in Florence wishing to purchase goods in Bruges. Instead of carrying sacks of coin, he could visit the Medici bank, deposit money there, and receive a letter of credit. This document was then carried to a branch of the bank in Bruges, where it could be redeemed for local currency. The merchant's wealth traveled safely on paper rather than in gold. More importantly, the system allowed wealth to move across borders with greater speed and security. Trade expanded, connections deepened, and trust in banking became a cornerstone of European commerce. The Medici perfected these tools and spread them across a wide network of branches, each carefully positioned in the major cities of Europe. From Florence, their reach extended to Venice, Rome, Milan, Bruges, London, Avignon, and beyond. Each branch was more than an office. It was a node in a living network that connected trade routes across the continent. Wool from England, silk from the East, spices from the Levant, and silver from Germany all passed through channels shaped by Medici finance. Their bank served not only merchants but also rulers and even the papacy. Popes turned to the Medici for loans to fund cathedrals, crusades, and ceremonies. Kings relied on them to pay armies and arrange marriages that required extravagant dowries. By handling such high-level finances, the Medici positioned themselves as indispensable to both secular and spiritual power. Florence, once a modest trading city, was transformed by this financial web into a global powerhouse. Wealth poured in not only from textiles and crafts, but also from the invisible stream of banking profits. With this new wealth came a surge of opportunities. Artists flocked to the city because patrons now had the means to commission works on an unprecedented scale. Scholars were drawn to Florence because libraries, academies, and schools found funding from families enriched by Medici finance. Architects raised grand buildings, not because Florence alone had skilled builders, but because Florence now had the resources to pay for visionary projects. This transformation was not simply about accumulation of wealth. It was about creating a system that multiplied opportunity. Double-entry bookkeeping made it possible to manage larger and more complex businesses. Letters of credit allowed merchants to take risks without carrying their fortune on their belts. The banking network spread trust across distances, making it possible for a merchant in Bruges to rely on the promise of a banker in Florence. Together, these tools created a new environment in which trade, art, politics, and culture could grow. The genius of the Medici was in recognizing that money could do more than sit in vaults. It could be set into motion, moving invisibly through networks of paper and trust. This circulation of wealth built a foundation on which Florence could rise, not only as a center of commerce, but also as a cradle of creativity. In this way, the Medici were not only bankers but also architects of a new world, one in which financial systems supported human achievement. This birth of financial genius was the continuation of the invisible hand already shaping Florence. Giovanni di Bicci had laid the groundwork by building a bank that operated across borders. Cosimo had expanded its reach, understanding that political influence and cultural patronage flowed from financial stability. Lorenzo carried it further, merging the power of finance with the brilliance of art and humanism. Each generation refined the system, creating not just a family legacy, but a lasting change in how Europe managed wealth. What makes this transformation so striking is how natural it feels to us now. We take for granted that businesses use balanced ledgers, that banks allow us to transfer money across distances, and that financial institutions support the ambitions of governments and individuals. Yet in the early days of the Renaissance, these ideas were nothing short of extraordinary. To deposit coin in Florence and withdraw it in London seemed almost like magic. To look at a book of accounts and see both the loss and the gain side by side felt like stepping into a new clarity. The Medici brought this magic into daily use, demystifying finance and making it accessible. The impact of this system extended far beyond Florence. Other banking families, inspired or rivaling the Medici, adopted similar methods. Trade routes expanded, cities grew richer, and the interconnected economy of Europe began to take form. By stabilizing the movement of money, the Medici indirectly supported the great voyages of discovery that soon followed, because explorers, too, relied on credit and loans to fund their journeys. In a very real sense, the Medici's banking methods laid the groundwork for the modern global economy. Florence itself became more than a city. It became a symbol of what could happen when financial genius combined with artistic brilliance. Streets were lined with workshops where masters created art that still captivates us. Cathedrals rose with domes that defied engineering expectations. Philosophers debated ideas that would shape modern thought. None of this existed in isolation. It was made possible because money flowed invisibly through networks designed by the Medici. The city attracted talent and ideas because it offered not only inspiration, but also security and opportunity. As this new system spread, the Medici themselves became something larger than a family of bankers. They were seen as the hidden stewards of Florence, the patrons of its beauty, and the guardians of its prosperity. Their name became inseparable from the identity of the city. Even when rivals rose or political crises shook Florence, the Medici network remained central to its survival. The invisible hand they extended through finance was strong enough to steady a city, support a culture, and in time, influence a continent. The birth of financial genius was not about a single invention or one brilliant mind. It was about a family that understood the hidden potential of trust, calculation, and circulation. They saw that money was not static but dynamic, that wealth could grow by moving, and that trust could be as valuable as gold. In doing so, they gave Florence the tools to rise above its size and become a force that shaped history. Their quiet revolution in banking was as transformative as any military conquest or royal decree, and it left behind a legacy that still touches the way the modern world works. The genius of the Medici in creating financial systems that carried money invisibly across Europe did not remain confined to the world of merchants and trade. Once the foundation of banking had been laid, the family understood that wealth on its own was not enough to ensure lasting power. Money had to be transformed into influence, and influence had to be embedded in the political and cultural life of Florence and beyond. This transformation from mere bankers to masters of hidden authority marked the next phase in their ascent, where ledgers and letters of credit turned into the levers of power. The Medici realized that finance could do more than enrich, it could rule, and they applied this principle with subtle brilliance. One of the earliest examples of this transformation can be seen in the way Giovanni de' Bicci and his successors cultivated relationships with the papacy. The church was one of the greatest consumers of wealth in Europe. It needed funds to build cathedrals, support charities, finance crusades, and maintain its vast bureaucracy. By positioning themselves as the official bankers of the papacy, the Medici placed themselves at the center of Christendom's financial heart. Loans to the church were not simply transactions, they were investments in influence. When popes needed vast sums for projects, such as the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, they turned to the Medici. With every loan, the family gained leverage, shaping papal decisions and securing favors that extended far beyond the balance sheets. Their position as papal bankers meant that even spiritual authority was touched by their invisible hand. This influence extended to kings as well. Monarchs across Europe were often strapped for cash, especially during times of war or political upheaval. Armies had to be paid, fortresses maintained, and courts funded. The Medici could provide the necessary funds, and in doing so, they placed rulers in a position of dependency. A king who borrowed heavily from the Medici might later find himself pressured to support Florentine interests or mediate disputes in ways favorable to the family. Unlike the blunt force of armies, financial pressure was subtle. It could be applied gradually, invisibly, and without the spectacle of open confrontation. This was the genius of Medici power. They rarely appeared to force events, but their financial networks allowed them to shape outcomes in ways that seemed natural, almost inevitable. Within Florence, the family faced rivals who resented their rising dominance. Florence prided itself on being a republic, where power was shared among leading families and not concentrated in the hands of one. Yet the Medici bent this republican ideal without shattering it. They avoided the appearance of tyranny, even as they quietly pulled the strings of government. Loans, favors, and carefully timed gifts allowed them to build alliances. Rivals were not always crushed outright. Often they were neutralized through financial dependency. A family that borrowed heavily from the Medici could hardly oppose them in council chambers. In other cases, exile was used as a gentler weapon than assassination, removing opponents without creating martyrs. This balancing act kept Florence outwardly free while inwardly governed by the steady hand of the Medici. Cosimo de' Medici was especially skilled at this invisible form of rule. He mastered the art of patronage, ensuring that wealth flowed in ways that not only enriched allies but also strengthened his hold on the city. When he funded the building of monasteries, libraries, or public works, he was not simply being generous. Each act of patronage created loyalty, binding institutions and individuals to his family. Even artistic commissions had a political purpose. By funding churches and public art, Cosimo tied his name to the spiritual and cultural life of Florence, making it impossible to separate the city's glory from Medici support. He never claimed the title of ruler, yet his influence was so complete that contemporaries remarked Florence obeyed his will as though he were a prince. The story of Lorenzo de' Medici illustrates how this strategy reached even greater heights. Known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, he combined financial acumen with political skill and cultural brilliance. His era was one of constant intrigue, with rival families and external powers threatening Florence. Lorenzo's response was not to build armies, but to weave a web of diplomacy and patronage, supported by the family's financial might. When enemies plotted against him, as in the famous Puzzi conspiracy, Lorenzo survived not only through courage, but through the network of loyalties he had cultivated. The Medici wealth ensured that Florence could withstand crises, while their control over loans and trade routes gave them bargaining power in negotiations with other Italian states. Beyond Florence, Lorenzo's influence extended into the courts of Europe. By financing marriages, treaties, and alliances, he placed his family at the crossroads of European politics. When the balance of power shifted in Italy, Lorenzo's financial resources allowed him to act as a mediator, ensuring Florence remained secure while rivals struggled. This was financial diplomacy at its peak. Wars were prevented or redirected not by soldiers, but by the careful distribution of credit, loans, and payments. Lorenzo's court also became a magnet for artists, philosophers, and writers, whose works not only enriched Florence culturally, but also projected Medici prestige across the continent. To support Botticelli, or the young Michelangelo, was not only an act of generosity. It was a declaration that Florence, under Medici guidance, was the intellectual and artistic leader of Europe. The Medici influence reached critical historical events that shaped the trajectory of nations. Their role as papal bankers, for example, linked them to the financing of massive projects in Rome, including the expansion of St. Peter's Basilica. These projects, funded in part by Medici loans, became symbols of the church's grandeur, but also set in motion controversies that would later contribute to the Reformation. By funding the papacy, the Medici inadvertently shaped the religious conflicts of the next century. Similarly, their support of exploration and trade indirectly supported the voyages that opened the New World to Europe. Although the family is remembered for art and politics in Florence, their financial network underpinned the broader shifts that connected Europe to global trade routes. One striking example of their direct political influence can be seen in the way Medici wealth shaped the papacy itself. Two members of the family eventually became popes, Leo X and Clement VII. Their elections were not accidents of fate, but the culmination of decades of financial ties, alliances, and influence cultivated by the family. As popes, they extended Medici power into the heart of Christendom, blending spiritual authority with financial might. Decisions made in Rome under their leadership were deeply tied to Florentine interests, showing how banking wealth could elevate a family from merchants to spiritual leaders of the Catholic world. This blending of finance, religion, and politics demonstrated the full scope of Medici influence. Even artistic movements were touched by their financial hand. The Renaissance, often celebrated as a rebirth of classical knowledge and artistic creativity, was not a spontaneous eruption of genius. It was nurtured by patronage, guided by commissions, and supported by the flow of wealth. The Medici ensured that Florence became the capital of this cultural flowering, and in doing so, they shaped the artistic identity of Europe. Without their financial support, many of the masterpieces we now revere might never have been created. Their money not only built palaces and churches, but also preserved manuscripts, funded translations, and supported thinkers who bridged the gap between ancient philosophy and modern science. The subtlety of Medici power lay in its invisibility. Rivals who sought open control often failed, because they underestimated the strength of financial networks. Armies could be defeated, but credit and debt endured. A rival might win a political battle, yet find himself unable to fund his ambitions without turning to the very family he opposed. In this way, the Medici held Florence in a grip that was both firm and hidden, a dominion that seemed less like conquest and more like inevitability. Their genius was to make power appear natural, as though the city's prosperity itself demanded their leadership. This invisible dominion was not without risk. Banking fortunes could collapse, as happened when branches faced difficulties abroad. Political opposition sometimes surged, as in the aftermath of Lorenzo's death. Yet the resilience of the Medici lay in their ability to adapt. Even when expelled from Florence, the family used their wealth and connections to return, reclaiming influence through alliances, papal support, and financial leverage. Their story shows how money, when transformed into influence, could endure through setbacks, rising again with new strength. The connection between finance and geopolitics became clear as the Medici moved beyond Florence. By supporting popes and kings, financing wars and treaties, and shaping the flow of trade, they linked their fortune to the destiny of Europe. Their role in major historical events was not always visible, yet it was decisive. Behind the grandeur of art and the drama of politics, the ledgers of the Medici Bank recorded the quiet transactions that enabled these events to unfold. They remind us that history is not only written by soldiers and statesmen, but also by bankers who knew how to turn gold into power and power into legacy. The invisible dominion of the Medici did not rest only in banks, papal chambers, or political councils. The family understood that true power must be seen as well as felt. Their financial influence, while immense, operated in quiet channels, but human memory is not built on ledgers. It is built on images, monuments, and ideas that stand long after names of bankers or merchants might otherwise fade. The Medici realized that if they were to secure not only control of Florence, but also an enduring legacy, they had to invest in what could make the city the center of the world's attention. This led to their most famous achievement, the deliberate transformation of wealth into art, science, and philosophy. What might appear on the surface as generosity or love of beauty was in fact a carefully designed strategy, a patronage system that elevated Florence into the beating heart of the Renaissance. Cosimo de' Medici, who had already established his subtle rule through finance and politics, was the first to grasp how art and scholarship could reinforce his authority. He knew that a chapel filled with beauty or a library brimming with knowledge could speak louder than any proclamation of power. One of his most significant projects was the reconstruction of the San Marco Monastery, where he funded not only the building itself, but also the frescoes painted by Fra Angelico. These works inspired devotion while at the same time embedding the Medici name in the spiritual and cultural life of the city. Similarly, Cosimo funded the first public library in Florence, ensuring that ancient manuscripts recovered from the East were translated and made accessible to scholars. Such an investment was not merely an act of kindness. It tied the Medici to the rebirth of classical knowledge, making them guardians of wisdom and progress. Architecture became another canvas for Medici ambition. Cosimo commissioned Filippo Brunelleschi, the genius architect who had already stunned Florence by completing the massive dome of the cathedral, to design the Medici Palace. Unlike the Gothic structures of the past, the palace was built with the proportions and harmony of classical architecture, embodying the new spirit of the Renaissance. Its elegance was a visible declaration that the Medici were not simply wealthy merchants, but leaders of a cultural movement. Every stone of the palace reinforced their image as patrons of innovation and refinement. Lorenzo the Magnificent expanded this vision with unmatched intensity. His court became a gathering place for the greatest minds of his time, creating a cultural machine that turned Florence into the envy of Europe. Lorenzo's patronage extended to poets, philosophers, and scientists, but it was in art that his influence was most visible. He supported Sandro Botticelli, whose works such as The Birth of Venus and Primavera embodied the blending of classical mythology and Renaissance humanism. These paintings were more than decorative pieces. They symbolized the intellectual atmosphere Lorenzo cultivated, where ancient stories were reinterpreted through the lens of new ideas. To fund such works was to align the Medici name with the highest achievements of human creativity. Another young artist brought into the Medici circle was Michelangelo. Discovered by Lorenzo, the young sculptor was brought into the Medici household, where he grew up surrounded by philosophers, poets, and fellow artists. The exposure shaped his genius, and in time he would create works that defined the Renaissance, from the statue of David to the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Michelangelo's connection to the Medici was not coincidental. It was the result of Lorenzo's foresight in nurturing talent, ensuring that the greatest masterpieces of the age would carry the imprint of his patronage. In supporting Michelangelo, Lorenzo was not just funding an artist, he was planting the seeds of immortality for his family name. The Medici influence reached into philosophy as well. Under Lorenzo's support, Marsilio Ficino translated the works of Plato and other classical thinkers into Latin, making them accessible to a wide audience. Ficino's academy in Florence, financed by the Medici, became a center for the revival of Platonic philosophy, blending ancient ideas with Christian thought. This intellectual movement, known as Neoplatonism, shaped Renaissance concepts of beauty, love, and harmony, influencing artists and thinkers alike. By sponsoring such endeavors, the Medici positioned themselves not only as financial rulers, but also as intellectual leaders. They became the patrons of a worldview that celebrated human dignity, reason, and creativity. Science too benefited from Medici patronage. While the family is best remembered for art, their support extended to those who sought to understand the natural world. In later generations, Galileo Galilei found protection and funding from the Medici. He dedicated his work on celestial observations to Cosimo II de' Medici, and in return the family shielded him, at least for a time, from the wrath of religious authorities who opposed his discoveries. The connection between Galileo and the Medici illustrates how their patronage helped advance scientific thought, linking their name not only to beauty and philosophy, but also to the new science that would transform human understanding of the universe. What emerges from these examples is a clear pattern. The Medici did not treat patronage as charity or personal indulgence. Each commission, each investment in knowledge or art, served a strategic purpose. By funding architecture, they reshaped the face of Florence. By supporting artists, they ensured that their family name would be immortalized in masterpieces. By financing philosophers and scientists, they aligned themselves with the most progressive currents of thought. In every case, money was turned into prestige, and prestige into power. Their patronage machine was as carefully designed as their financial network, and together they created a system that made Florence the cultural capital of the world. The explosion of creativity that defined the Renaissance was not accidental. It was the direct result of conditions that allowed artists and thinkers to work without constant fear of poverty. The Medici provided those conditions, offering not only money but also protection, space, and audiences. A painter like Botticelli could not have created vast mythological canvases without the security of a patron who valued such work. A philosopher like Ficino could not have translated Plato without financial support and a circle of intellectuals sustained by Medici resources. A scientist like Galileo needed more than curiosity. He needed instruments, publication, and protection, all of which came from the Medici. The family acted as catalysts, turning potential into achievement, and in the process tying their fortunes to the greatest flowering of culture in European history. Their strategy also created a symbiotic relationship between money and genius. Artists needed patrons to realize their visions, and patrons needed artists to embody their power in visible form. The Medici mastered this relationship, ensuring that every brushstroke, every marble statue, and every philosophical treatise carried within it a reflection of their influence. Unlike the ephemeral nature of political decrees or financial ledgers, art and ideas endured. Long after the Medici faced political challenges or banking setbacks, their patronage continued to speak, preserved in stone, paint, and words. This enduring visibility was crucial for the family. Political rivals might expel them from Florence, as happened more than once, but they could not erase the churches, palaces, and works of art tied to the Medici name. Even in exile, the family's presence remained etched into the very fabric of the city. When they returned to power, they resumed their role as patrons, demonstrating again that their influence was as much cultural as it was financial. This dual power, money and memory, made their authority unusually resilient, capable of surviving upheaval and renewal. The Renaissance, as it blossomed under Medici patronage, was not simply a period of artistic brilliance. It was a redefinition of human potential, an awakening that combined art, science, and philosophy into a vision of what humanity could achieve. The Medici did not create this movement alone, but they were its greatest enablers. Their strategic use of patronage turned Florence into a stage where the brightest minds and most skilled hands could perform. In return, these artists and thinkers gave the Medici something even greater than wealth. They gave them a place in history that no amount of political or financial maneuvering could secure on its own. The connection between the Medici and the Renaissance reveals a deeper truth about how power operates. Armies may conquer and money may command, but it is culture that endures. The Medici grasped this truth earlier than most, and they invested in it with the same precision they brought to banking. Their patronage was the engine of the Renaissance machine, transforming Florence from a city of merchants into the lighthouse of a new age. Every painting, every dome, every poem was a brick in the monument they built to themselves, a monument that still stands centuries later. Their genius lay in seeing what others overlooked. That power was not only about ruling in the present, but also about shaping how the future would remember the past. By pouring wealth into art, science, and philosophy, they ensured that their invisible hand would not only guide their contemporaries, but also reach forward through time, touching us still. In this way, the Medici demonstrated that money, when combined with vision, could create not just wealth or authority, but civilization itself. The Medici did not simply fund a cultural rebirth or shape the politics of a city. Their greatest and most enduring legacy lies in the systems they created, the financial structures that spread far beyond Florence and continued to echo long after their family's direct influence waned. When we trace the lines from their innovations in bookkeeping, credit, and international banking networks, we find that they connect directly to the foundations of modern finance. What began as a way to help merchants move wool and silk across Europe became the scaffolding upon which global trade, banking, and even capitalism itself were built. The echoes of this empire of finance still reach us today, guiding the way money flows, how economies are managed, and how invisible power shapes nations. The most direct connection lies in the system of double-entry bookkeeping, a method that now underpins every modern business and government account. The simplicity of writing down every debit alongside a corresponding credit hides the revolutionary nature of the system. It provided clarity, accountability, and trust in transactions. Without this, the scale of modern commerce would be unmanageable. Every corporation today, from the smallest family business to the largest international conglomerate, relies on this same principle. It is astonishing to think that a practice nurtured in Renaissance Florence has become a universal language of finance. The Medici did not invent it entirely, but they were instrumental in spreading and refining it, showing its power in real-world banking. In doing so, they created a tool that would prove more enduring than any fortress or palace. Equally transformative were the letters of credit and bills of exchange that allowed money to move invisibly across borders. In an age when transporting coin meant risk of theft and loss, these instruments replaced metal with trust. A merchant in London could deposit wealth with a Medici branch there and draw on it in Florence or Bruges. This early form of financial paper was the ancestor of modern checks, bank transfers, and even digital payments. International trade today, whether through electronic wire transfers or credit card networks, follows the same principle the Medici perfected. The promise of value traveling across space without the physical danger of moving gold or silver. By proving that trust could replace tangible wealth, the Medici opened the door to an economy not bound by physical limits, but able to expand across oceans and continents. Their model of a banking network also set the stage for the rise of multinational financial institutions. The Medici Bank established branches across Europe, each connected to a central hub in Florence, but each also adapted to local needs. This structure resembles the modern system of international banks with offices across continents, all tied to a central balance sheet. Even the concept of risk management, of diversifying branches and clients, grew out of the lessons the Medici learned when some branches failed while others flourished. Today, global banking institutions operate on principles that echo those early experiments, showing how Renaissance innovation continues to shape our financial lives centuries later. But these achievements did not come without consequences. The Medici story forces us to confront the ethical dilemmas that arise when financial power becomes immense. By controlling the purse strings of popes, kings, and republics, the family held influence that was invisible but profound. Their loans could decide wars, determine papal elections, and shape the fate of entire nations. Yet this power was concentrated in the hands of a few individuals, unelected and often unaccountable. Florence was technically a republic, but the Medici bent its politics to their will through the subtle use of wealth. They taught Europe a lesson that still resonates today. Money is not just a tool of trade, but also a tool of control. This raises difficult questions about responsibility. When a banker holds the ability to determine whether a ruler can fund an army, or whether an artist can complete a masterpiece, that banker is shaping history as much as any soldier or statesman. The Medici often used their wealth to build rather than to destroy. They funded art, architecture, and philosophy that continue to inspire humanity. But their same wealth also entrenched inequalities, propped up regimes, and contributed indirectly to conflicts fueled by papal ambition or royal rivalry. The moral weight of their decisions cannot be ignored. They remind us that financial innovation, while powerful, carries with it obligations that go beyond profit. Consider their role in the papacy. By funding massive building projects in Rome, the Medici strengthened the grandeur of the Church. Yet those same projects required the sale of indulgences and other practices that outraged reformers like Martin Luther, eventually sparking the Reformation. Here we see the double edge of Medici influence: magnificent achievements on one hand, unintended upheaval on the other. Their loans to monarchs allowed kingdoms to expand their power, but they also entrenched cycles of debt that shaped political dependency. Even their patronage of art, while creating timeless beauty, was also a form of propaganda, reinforcing their dominance and shaping cultural memory in ways that marginalized their rivals. The consequences of Medici financial innovation can be traced forward into our own era. Modern banking institutions wield similar influence, capable of stabilizing economies or plunging them into crisis. Just as the Medici once held the fate of Florence and Rome in their ledgers, today's global banks influence nations, shaping policies and decisions through credit, investment, and debt. The lessons of the Medici remind us that financial tools are never neutral. They can create prosperity, but they can also create dependency and imbalance. Their story challenges us to ask how power should be managed when it is invisible, and what responsibilities come with controlling the lifeblood of economies. At the same time, the Medici show us the extraordinary potential of finance when harnessed for vision. Their patronage demonstrates that wealth, when invested in creativity and knowledge, can elevate not only a family, but an entire civilization. They remind us that financial power need not be sterile, confined to balance sheets and accounts. It can be turned into domes that defy gravity, paintings that stir the soul, and philosophies that reshape human thought. The Renaissance was not only about individual genius. It was about the environment that allowed genius to thrive, and the Medici created that environment with the tools of finance. The echoes of their empire are felt every time we use a bank card, balance a ledger, or wire money across the globe. The systems they built continue to operate, refined and digitized, but essentially unchanged in their principles. Their story shows that history is not only written in battles or treaties, but also in the quiet revolutions of numbers and trust. The invisible hand that guided Florence now guides the world, its legacy embedded in the way we live and trade. Yet the Medici also leave us with a question that lingers, one that reaches beyond their time into ours. If invisible financial power could shape the course of the Renaissance, steering art, politics, and religion, what unseen forces are shaping our own world today? Who holds the levers of influence in our time, hidden behind the screens of banks, corporations, and digital networks? And do they, like the Medici, see beyond profit to the responsibilities that come with power? Their story ends with a paradox. They began as merchants, rose as bankers, ruled as patrons, and transformed into dynasts whose name became synonymous with culture and power. Yet their true empire was not the palaces they built or the titles they held. It was the invisible system of finance they perfected, a system that still governs how wealth moves, how power is distributed, and how societies flourish or falter. The echoes of that empire continue to resound, reminding us that the unseen can be stronger than the seen, and that the hand that balances accounts may also balance the fate of nations. So as we look back on Florence and its extraordinary flowering under the Medici, we are left not only with admiration for their brilliance, but also with a challenge. To recognize that the structures they built endure, that their power is still with us in every transaction, and that the responsibility to use such power wisely now falls to others. The Renaissance reminds us what can be achieved when wealth is invested in vision. The Medici remind us that invisible influence is both a gift and a burden, and the world we inhabit asks us, silently but insistently, whose invisible hand shapes our future, and to what end?